Welcome. I'm going to continue our study in Abraham, on Abraham in Genesis. This week I don't have a PowerPoint or special, opening or closing screen. I just have the passage on the screen, and I'm just going to sort of ramble about it. It's organized rambling, but I'm going to just sort of talk about it and make 3 points about this passage. This is a fairly insignificant passage, just a small section in between two really big significant events. In the previous chapter, in this chapter in the previous one, we just had Isaac born after years of waiting. And then in the next chapter, we have the pivotal moment when Abraham is asked to be willing to sacrifice Isaac. So that's coming up. But right here, there's a short section about Abimelech, which is a title. It may not be the same Abimelech as we just saw in the last chapter, or the last couple chapters. It could just mean whoever the current king of the Philistines is, but it's Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of the Philistine army. And this is kind of interesting in light of the fact that the Philistines and Israelites were in constant conflict from the time of the judges onwards, especially through David's reign. The Philistines were constantly harassing and attacking Israel, and Israel attacked back and took some of the Philistine territory and everything else. Because in this passage, we see an alliance made, a covenant made between Israel and Philistia to say that they would not attack each other and that they would be on each other's side. So it's kind of interesting. It lasted pretty long, I suppose, but it didn't last as long as you might have hoped. But anyway, here's what it says. Now it came about at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, I don't know how that's pronounced, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham, saying, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my offspring or with my posterity. In other words, with me or with my children or with my children's children. But according to the kindness that I have shown to you, you shall show to me into the land in which you have sojourned. Abraham said, I swear it. He says, Abraham, I've been kind to you. I've not been attacking you or harassing you. I've been supporting you and helping you out. I want you to promise that you will do the same for me and all my descendants, and I want us to make a covenant about this. Abraham was apparently important enough, rich enough, and powerful enough that for a small local king like Abimelech, it was worth making a covenant with him. He was worth paying attention to and getting on the good side of. But Abraham complained to Abimelech because of the well of water, which the servants of Abimelech had seized. And Abimelech said, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, nor did I hear of it until today. Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them made a covenant. The sheep and the oxen here weren't gifts to Abimelech. They were used for the sacrifice. And it might have been that Abraham gave them to show that he was rich enough to do it. It might have been that they were where Abraham was staying, and so Abraham was the one who had the things handy, had the animals handy. But he took sheep and oxen, gave them to Abimelech. The two of them made a covenant, sacrificing those animals. And then he did something else. Then Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock by themselves. Abimelech said to Abraham, What do these 7 ewe lambs mean, which you've set by themselves? He said, You shall take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand, so that it may be a witness to me that I dug this well, that this really belongs to me. It's interesting. He didn't say, I dug this well, you need to pay me. He said, I dug this well, I'm going to give you a gift as a testimony, as a witness to me that I dug this well. And he really means as a witness to you that I dug this well. It's sort of like if you didn't already accept what I said just because I gave you my word for it, I've even paid you again. And you should have no reason not to respect my rights to this well going forwards. So they made a covenant. So therefore, he called that place Beersheba, which means the well of underground water or something similar to that, because there the two of them took an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba, and Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, arose and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned in the land of the Philistines for many days. All right. So I already interrupted with a couple of comments. Let me just make a few comments about this. And then there's 3 main things I sort of want to think about here. The first one, let me just walk back through the story and see if there's anything I wanted to emphasize. I'm not completely clear where this takes place. I think Abraham is living in the territory of the Philistines at this point. But it says at the end of this, it says at the end of this that Abimelech and Phicol returned to the land of the Philistines. So I think it means as opposed to wherever Abraham was staying. But then it also says Abraham sojourned in the land of the Philistines for many days. Well, if they were in Israel, why would he have run over to the Philistines after that? So I'm not quite sure how all that works out. I looked a little bit in commentaries and couldn't find any answer. But I think what it means is that Abraham was already kind of living in the land of the Philistines, but on his own place, maybe sort of separate or maybe sort of adjoining Israel. And Abimelech came over to his place to talk with him, and then went back to his own place, maybe his own wherever his capital was. But Abraham stayed there for a while. So the first thing to notice, this isn't one of the three main things I'm focusing on, but just as we look at this, notice this is about the covenant made between the Philistines and Israel, between Abimelech and Abraham. And their agreement is we're going to continue to be friendly to each other, to support each other, to be kind to one another for all of our days and for our children's days and for our children's days. And it's interesting, again, this didn't necessarily last. We'll see. We won't see. I won't study it. But by the time of the Judges, the Philistines started attacking and trying to take over the place that the Israelites were. Now, that was 400 years later, so I guess it lasted pretty long. But that's because the Israelites were carried off to Egypt for a while. But when they came back, it wasn't too long before the Philistines were attacking them. And eventually, David helped conquer a lot of them. So there's a whole other story there. But Abimelech says, look, I've been kind to you. Will you promise to be kind to me? And I want that promise to be from now on. And one of the things I will eventually want to look at is the long-lasting nature of this covenant that they made. Let's see. I don't know why that popped up. I don't know if it did for you. I had a screen pop up, something pop up on my screen about with my files in it or something. But anyway, I'm back to my notes. And Abraham agrees to have that covenant. They did the covenant according to the way they would do covenants at that time. They made the covenant through sacrificing some animals and then using those sacrifices to commemorate the covenant. And the idea is that they were promising before God to have this loyal relationship to one another. Then there's this issue of the well that comes up, and Abraham pays or gives as a gift to Abimelech these 7 ewes, these 7 ewe lambs, to say, I want to be sure that we both remember. He says me, but he means Abimelech. He says, I want to be sure we both remember that this was my well that you seized, and you're giving it back to me. And they made this covenant. And then he plants a tree and calls on the name of the everlasting God. And then it just continues with the story by saying, and he stayed there in the land of the Philistines for several days. All right. 3 things, as I was praying about this and thinking about it, 3 things occurred to me that are kind of significant here. I'm sure there's more, but 3 things that occurred to me that I felt like God wanted me to think about as I looked at this. The first one I'm going to spend the most time on. It's what really struck me most. This is an example of something that we have seen all the way along in the story of Abraham. And that is that Abraham experienced the favor of God. God was with him. Abimelech says to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. That's why I want to make this covenant with you. And we've seen that from the beginning. Several different places, Abraham goes somewhere and then prospers and does really well, and God is with him in all that he does. He delivers all the kings, and God is with him in that as well. And over and over, God favors Abraham. That's sort of the third part of the promise he made to him. He promised him descendants, he promised him a land, and he promised he would be with him and walk with him and support him and be his God and be a help to him. And this comes up again and again. And the interesting thing is, just like the other 2 things of the covenant, it's not really conditional on Abraham's constant faith and obedience. Abraham sometimes did things badly, and God still blessed him. God still favored him. And the point of the story is not to show us, look how good Abraham was. Look how amazingly godly Abraham was that God blessed him. It's just to say, look how faithful God was. Look how consistent God was. Look how loving God was. The word loving kindness that is used in the Old Testament for God's love can also be translated as God's covenant love, the love that he has for his people as a special people that he just chooses to show favor to. And it's a picture of the way that we should think about God's relationship to us. He loves us not because we've somehow earned that love, but because he's chosen to adopt us into his family as his children, and he just chooses to pour out his love on us. And he loves everybody, but there's a sense in which his love for us as his adopted children, once we are saved, is kind of a special family love that has a special meaning. And so I was thinking about what it was to say that God was with Abraham, and how was he favored? And it made me think about a lot of the ways that the scriptures talk about God showing favor to us. And it made me think about this. I was talking about this with somebody a week ago. Made me think about this question. In what ways are our lives better off because we follow God and because we're in a relationship with God? And in what ways are they harder? Because as we often hear, it isn't automatic that just because you become a Christian that all your troubles disappear. Sometimes you have more troubles because you're a Christian. But I don't want to go too far in that, because there is something about following God that just is good for us. And so I started thinking about several different things. Number one, in the law, they actually had promises that said, if you keep the law, I will bless your nation. You'll have prosperity as a nation. You'll have good crops. You'll have good economic conditions. You'll have victory in battle. Everything will go well. But that, of course, was a national promise. It didn't mean that every individual in the nation would always have all the same success himself. But if the nation as a whole was following God, God said, then I will keep your nation doing well. And if you don't follow me, then your nation will experience difficulties. But again, that's a national thing. Individuals could have good or bad fortune, or it's not really fortune if God's behind it. They could experience the favor or not of God. Sometimes separately from what was happening in the nation as a whole. But it does make a difference. If you're living in a nation that God is blessing, you'll live a life that's somewhat blessed. If you're living in a nation that God is bringing cursing to, you're going to live in a nation that's somewhat cursed. If if America has been blessed by God to some degree, it was good for all of us to be here. Even for unbelievers, they got the benefit of that. And if America begins to fall into God's judgment, which I think it may be, that will cause economic havoc and other kinds of difficulties and division among the leadership and all sorts of things. That's something we will all experience and have to struggle through. All right. But that's the law. The law was conditional. It was, you do that. If you obey me, I'll bless you. And fortunately for us, there's a lot of other things about the blessings of God that aren't so conditional. The second place that you see talk about the value, the blessing of following God is in Proverbs, where you get the wisdom blessings. And there the promise is not, if you keep the law, he will bless you. It's, if you do things God's way, it will go better. Over and over and over, there's different things where it says, if you do things God's way in terms of being diligent, if you do things God's way in terms of having integrity, if you do things God's way in terms of caring for the poor, if you do things God's way in terms of being honest, whatever it is, it will go better for you. Now, that does not mean that if you obey God, nothing will go wrong. It means that you will be living life in the way that it's intended to be living, and you won't be adding difficulties to yourself. We may still have difficulties just because of the world we live in. I can live a perfect life and still have difficulties. Look at Jesus. He lived a perfect life and he suffered tremendously for our sake, but he suffered a lot and a lot of people persecuted him. And so you can be following God and have great difficulties, but your difficulties won't be coming from the fact that you're disobeying God. They won't be coming from the fact that you're trying to make life work in a way that it isn't designed to work. They won't be coming because of your own foolishness. They'll be coming because of other reasons. And so Proverbs sort of says the baseline is live wisely and it will have repercussions in your life. Live foolishly, that'll have different repercussions in your life. But it never means that people can't override those things. It doesn't mean that just because you're living wisely, that everything has to go well. People can come in and wickedly take away the things that you would otherwise be able to be blessed by. They can steal from you. They can persecute you. They can hurt you in different ways. Proverbs isn't saying those things can't happen. But it is saying at least you'll be getting things right in the area of following God. And so it is just true that if we follow God and follow God's principles and do things God's way, we won't be bucking against the way that life works. We'll be working with it. And our lives will be easier and more smooth than they would have been otherwise. So I may have difficulties, but I won't have the extra difficulties of going against God's wisdom. I'll have those things at least will go well. So if I have struggles in my marriage or struggles in my job or struggles in my world or struggles with my health, at least I will only have those struggles. I won't, in addition, have the struggles of fighting against God at every stage. Again, though, not only are those are sort of conditional, and which of us is always going to live wisely? We don't always. So in the New Testament, the good news is that the focus on the goodness of God and the favor of God to us is not based on our works at all, or even on our wisdom. It's based on grace. It's based on the gospel. And the idea is that God, instead of waiting until we act wisely enough that he can favor us, instead of waiting until we deserve his favor by what we obey, he reaches out to us. He died for us. He rose again for us. He reaches out for us and he says, let me adopt you as my children. Let me make you born again, begin to transform you. And even while you're still growing, even while you're still learning, you will experience the favor, the joy of knowing that you're walking with me. And I'll bring you joy and peace and patience and kindness and all the fruit of the Spirit as you walk with me. You'll abide with me and know you can trust me. You'll be able to know you don't have to worry about your food or your clothing because I will take care of everything for you. And the peace of God will be with you. And you may struggle, you may be tested, you may suffer, but you won't suffer alone. I will be near to you and help you and with you. And that doesn't depend on our having to be perfect in our actions or in our faith. It depends on the fact that we are trusting in Christ alone, putting everything on him. All right. However, none of this means we don't suffer or struggle as Christians for several reasons. First of all, as I said, I'll skip that. First of all, even in the Old Testament, none of this was meant to be a formula. God is not a vending machine that if we put in coins, we get whatever blessing we choose. He's not some sort of thing that we can control with magical rituals through our prayers or our obedience. It's not like we can say to God, look, I did this and I did this. You have to give me this now. Over and over in the Old Testament, it says, this is what you can expect from God. And then it says, but he's free to do whatever he wants, and you can never control that. So the book of Job is the best example of this. It's emphasized throughout the book that Job did the kinds of things that were right. He did the kinds of things that God asked for, and that normally speaking, he would have been blessed because of that. And before the book began, he had been blessed because of that. And after the book ends, he continues to be blessed because of that. But in the middle, during these 40 chapters, he was really suffering in ways that he didn't really deserve according to what people would have understood at the time. And what is partly saying is God can do whatever he wants. He can do whatever he wants, and he has purposes, which are explained in Job, but Job himself didn't hear the explanation. Job himself would have had no reason to know why it was happening the way it was happening. It would have been frustrating for him. He would have been thinking, how come things aren't working the way I expect? And one of the things we need to just recognize in our lives is that God is he's reliable. He's somebody you can depend on, but he's not a vending machine and he's not under our control. He's free to act in any way he wants. So he will bless, but he will bless sometimes the opposite of the way we expected him to bless. Another thing about this is to recognize that sometimes we will suffer, especially as Christians, because we are God's followers, because we are God's people, and the world is most opposed to God. We will suffer it sometimes in places in history because we are Christians. There are people, of course, who've been burned at the stake or stoned because of their faith. They certainly weren't finding life easier because they were Christians. In one sense, they weren't. But in another, that's because they were suffering for their faith. But even there in their suffering, they found joy and peace in the Holy Spirit, and they eventually in heaven found great reward for lasting through that. So it was a blessing in the long run. It just wasn't a blessing in the short run. Because we are Christians, God disciplines us. Sometimes that means when we're in sin, he brings hardships into our lives to get our attention, to get us to respond to him. But even when we're not in sin, it means he brings discipline into our lives to teach us lessons and to show us things and to develop our strength and our patience and our faith. And so sometimes we will go through trials specifically because it will bring God greater glory if we learn to trust him in those trials. And so, again, having the favor of God does not mean you never experience difficulties. Abraham certainly experienced difficulties. You'll see in the very next chapter, one of the hardest things he ever had to do. But it doesn't negate the favor of God. It just means that God is willing to sacrifice short-term happiness for greater long-term joy. And sometimes that is difficult at the time. Anyway, here's what I think, though, in the long run. One more thing. Sometimes as Christians, we are called to follow in the example of Christ. And the example of Christ, according to 1 Peter 2, is that he suffered. He suffered without complaint, and he suffered without being angry at God, without being angry at others, and it wasn't his fault. He suffered for us. And sometimes God may call us to suffer in our service to him for other people, to be willing to go through hardships or to have to give up a lot in order to bring the gospel to other people or just to love them effectively or even just to give for their sake. And that is, for us, a hardship, but it can also be a great joy, just as it was for Jesus to die for us. It was both very difficult and something he did for the joy set before him. And we are the joy set before him partly, and everything that he accomplished in his returning to be with the Father. So sometimes we are called to a path of suffering and a path of powerlessness. Sometimes God calls us as a church not to be successful in the world's eyes, but to seem powerless and ineffective. But in the Beatitudes, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are," and so on. And he basically says sometimes what looks like defeat is just being in the place of blessing, where because you are blessed, favored by God in a spiritual sense, even if the world can't see it. All right. Are we blessed by God just as Christians? Absolutely. God's love for us is so constant and so complete, and he cares about every detail of our lives, not just the long-term spiritual ones, but the short ones. And God frequently does things in our lives to just make our lives better and to just bring us joy. But he's also willing to push us and take us to some really difficult places, because that will bring us closer to him and increase our joy ultimately, and let us serve others and show our love to others ultimately. And so both are true. We experience some hardships because we follow Christ, and we experience great joy because we follow Christ. And what we need to do is have the expectation. This is something I'm not very good at, but I'm more and more convinced it's what we need to do. We need to have the expectation of good from God, but the willingness to accept that it may look very different than we expected. So we have the expectation that in some way, in some manner, God will pour out good on us. But we need to be willing for it to be different than we thought it was. Say, oh, that's not the good I expected. I expected this other thing, and you didn't give me that. But you did give me good somehow. It turned out to be over here. This is where you gave me the good. So we can expect God to bless. We can expect God will be with us. We can expect him to bring us a good life, but not necessarily by the terms that we put on it. Because part of what he wants to do is to teach us to trust him rather than ourselves. That's all sort of shown in a little miniature way in the life of Abraham. The second thing I want to talk about here is this issue of the well. I'm not going to spend very long on this, but it's fascinating. This king comes to you and says, I would like to make a covenant with you. This is very flattering. He says, I'm going to ask you to treat me well, and let's make a bargain. Let's make a covenant, not just a bargain. Let's make a commitment of loyalty to one another from now on and in perpetuity. And let's have this relationship with one another. And then Abraham says yes. And then he says, before we do this, I need to bring up an issue. You took my well away from me. And Abimelech says, I didn't even know we did that. I don't know who did that, but okay, I agree. We'll give it back to you. And Abraham doubles down and says, I'm going to set aside these ewe lambs, and I'm going to give them to you as a reminder to me. But he really means as a reminder to you that this is my well, and that you agree that it is mine, and that you will leave it to me. And this is fascinating because it took a lot of boldness. It was kind of gutsy for Abraham to call this out. It says in the original even, not just that he complained to Abimelech, but that he reproved Abimelech. This is kind of gutsy, and I don't think it's a bad thing here. I think it's a good thing. I think the point here is that to really have a good covenant, the air has to be cleared on all sides. It's sort of like those verses of the New Testament about worship, where it says, before you come to worship God, you have to think, does anybody have anything against you? Or do you have anything against them? And it says both in different verses. And if so, you need to go and get that right. And so it's like Abraham says to Abimelech, before we go making covenants, I need to bring up the thing that is in my mind between us. And Abimelech hadn't even heard about this. So this is important. Abimelech didn't know this had been done to Abraham. Abraham didn't know that Abimelech didn't know. Abraham needed to realize, oh, you really are kind of innocent in this. This doesn't mean that you were being hypocritical or that you're just trying to put on a power play. And Abimelech can show his good faith now by restoring the well. And Abraham can know that the air is clear between them and they can proceed with a covenant. So there's this issue of communication and of bringing things up, that we need to be willing to air any grievances that are there between us, even if they seem minor, or even if we're willing to go ahead and accept them. I mean, Abraham wasn't worried about the cost of this. He paid for himself. He gave these ewe lambs to Abimelech to sort of hold on. If it had been about the money, he would have said, look, you give me some ewe lambs to promise me that you see it was my well. But he didn't. He gave him even more. He lost even more financial material, money, riches, in order to keep the relationship right. But what he was saying is not, I'm so stingy that I need this, but that it bothers me that this happened. It was hard for us to see. It's hard for me to see how we can have a faithful, loyal relationship to one another if this is the way you treat me. And Abimelech could say, oh, I didn't realize, I will treat you better. And when Abraham gives him these lambs, it's a really interesting move because he's saying, now you have two reasons to remember that this is mine. On the one hand, you took my word for it when I said it was mine. But on the other hand, if you didn't believe that, you took the lambs from me. And that convinces me, that should remind you that you've agreed it was mine. I've sort of paid for the privilege. And so the important thing here, I think, is the really interesting example of Abraham being bold to bring up something he knew would be a grievance before they went into this covenant. The third thing I want to emphasize is that in this covenant, it's got an everlasting nature. Now, this isn't the way it worked out. The Philistines and the Israelites were at war with each other a few centuries later when Israel actually moved in and took over Canaan. But Abimelech is asking for a lasting covenant. Don't deal falsely with me or with my offspring or with my posterity. He means not with my children and not with my children's children, not with any of my descendants. Would you be good to me from now on? And would your people, your descendants, be good to my descendants from now on? And that's what they swear to. And then it says, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. He's called the everlasting God here because the covenant needs to go beyond the lifetime of Abraham and Abimelech. It needs to continue. And so he calls on the name of God as the one who's everlasting, who will be there to see to this covenant going on and on and on. And he planted a tamarisk tree because that's a tree that will take a long time to grow. And by planting something that will take a long time to grow, he's saying, I'm looking towards the long future. I may not be alive by the time this grows, but it will be a reminder that this covenant is supposed to endure and that God will watch over it far into the future, far beyond my own life, but into Isaac's life and even into his children's lives. And so this is all about the lastingness of the covenant and the lastingness of the God who oversees the covenant. And as the Israelites read this, it would have been a reminder to them that tamarisk tree being planted and the fact that God is the everlasting God. It would have been a reminder to them that when God chose Abraham and his descendants to be the people of God, the chosen people, he was going to keep that in place and he wasn't going to give up on it. Now, in the New Testament, that's been expanded to include all believers, but it's nonetheless still true that we have an everlasting God who has created with us an everlasting covenant, the new covenant of the gospel, and he will never give up on us and that will never go away. He will never cast us out as his children. We are going to be his from now on. And so we can do the equivalent of planting a tamarisk tree. We can say we are betting everything on this because it will last longer than our earthly lives. It will go on forever because we are trusting in the name of the Lord, who's the everlasting God. And we are trusting in this covenant that God has made with us through Jesus, through the blood of the cross, to hold on to us and to be our God forever and ever. And so that's also part of this story. So those three things, what it is to be blessed of God, and the fact that we are blessed of God as believers, we should look for that and see that and be excited about it where we see it. The fact that wherever there's a covenant or an agreement, there needs to be the air needs to be cleared of any grievances that might be in the way. And it's worth being blunt. It's worth bringing those things up and risking conflict to get them settled. But we need to do so with an attitude which is not grasping or not trying to get petty revenge or not trying to get payback, but genuinely letting go. Abraham showed by giving up these ewe lambs that he was genuinely letting go, but he really needed it to be dealt with. There's a difference between what's the word I'm looking for? Covering over things and actually forgiving them and letting them go. And Abraham did the second one where he called it out and then said, but I'm not holding on to this. And the third thing, again, is to remind us of the faithfulness of God in his covenants and his lastingness. And that the reason this covenant worked between two humans, or it could have worked if they stuck to it, is because there's an everlasting God behind it. And the reason our covenant through Christ works is because God's the one who created the covenant first and foremost and throughout, from beginning to end. And he is completely faithful in his covenant to us. All right, next week, we will begin to look at one of the most significant passages in the life of Abraham. I think that's next week, and I will see you then.